Okay, so this is a really great motion graphics piece, motion design piece. Obviously, we have some great design going on here, but we're going to take a look at this looping aspect. How do these things loop so perfectly? Well, it's really not that hard, so let's take a look at how it's done. Now, I didn't have the time to go ahead and design a rocket. Honestly, I'm not really much of a designer, so I found this rocket on Envato Elements, and just searching for rocket ship, and checking out their graphics section and their graphic template section. I found myself an Illustrator file. I did have to do some cleanup to organize all the layers here for After Effects, but it didn't take me too long. Okay, so in After Effects, I didn't recreate the entire project. That would have taken me way too long. So what I did do was I created a smaller project which just basically demonstrates the looping aspect of the clouds in the original piece. So let's make a loop. I will make a new project and start from scratch. I'll make a new composition and I will make it 1080 by 1920 to create a vertical composition, and I like to work with round numbers when I'm animating. So my frame rate is 30 and let's make this an even 10 seconds. In After Effects, the timeline will actually stop one frame before the duration of your comp, which is why I add this frame at the end. Okay, so I'll start by importing my rocket ship, making sure that it's the composition import kind and the footage dimensions are layer size. Dragging and dropping that composition into your timeline will make sure that it's centered up, and I will just scale this down. Let's go inside the composition and turn off some of these layers since I won't be using them. Actually, instead of turning off layers, let's just solo the layer that we need, which is our rocket ship. I'll leave the rocket ship where it is because I might want to come back and add some of these background elements. But for now, we'll come out of this composition. By the way, we should rename our comp. And I'll bring this composition down towards the bottom. I'll also check my continuously rasterize button so that my composition is the size of the elements within it. Okay, so let's start by animating this rocket ship going up and coming back down. I'll bring up my position property, separate my dimensions, and animate the Y position. At 40 frames, I'll take my Y position and decrease it, since we're decreasing the Y value because we're heading towards the 0 pixel over here. In After Effects, pixels are read going left from the top, so pixel 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 until 1080, and then the Y is going from 0 to 1920 in this case, because if we look at our composition settings, that's what our height is. 1920 pixels, and it starts at 0 over here. So since we're going towards 0, we have to decrease our Y value to head upwards. At 80 frames, doubling the 40th frame, since we're working every 40 frames, and I'm going to make this a loop, I will copy this first keyframe and paste it, and then I'll also press N on the keyboard to create a work area. Now, as I press play, you'll see that this is looping, but it's pretty basic since we're only working with linear keyframes. So let's play around with this. What I'll do is ease out of this keyframe. So I'll just right-click Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease out. I will easy ease in and out of this keyframe, so this will just be a normal easy ease. And then this last keyframe we will ease into. Okay, so we have the basic Y movement going on. Let's play with the rotation. I'll hit R on my keyboard to bring up my rotation, and set a keyframe at the beginning and at the end. We want to get to that middle mark, the 40th frame, and before we start rotating it, let's actually move the anchor point. So I'll grab my pan behind tool and move this anchor point holding shift up over here. I put it on top of here because I want the rotation to make it feel like we're being led from this area, from the top of it. I'll actually go halfway between the middle of our keyframes and our first keyframe, and I'll set this to something like 4. Then I'll go between our 40th frame and our last frame, that's 60, 20 frames after 40, and I'll set this to -4. Now I have to actually update the position of the rocket ship since I moved the anchor point. So let's look at our Y position again. Let's go to the beginning. We want to make sure that only our first keyframe is selected, or no keyframes are selected as long as we're right over it, and then just update the position of the rocket ship. We have to also copy this first frame, paste it over this one. I'll delete this one and then Control V. I need to reset this keyframe, so I'll just make sure that this is a linear keyframe. We need to reset this keyframe here, so I'll just right click, keyframe interpolation, and set this to linear. And then I'll right click, keyframe assistant, and ease in like we did originally. Let's watch this. Okay, so we have a rocket ship swaying back and forth. Let's work on those clouds. So in After Effects, there's always a million and one ways to do the same exact thing. What I did for the clouds might not be what other people would do for the clouds, but I think it works. So let's do it the way I came up with. First, I'll shut off my rocket ship so that I can just focus on my clouds. I'll start by selecting my ellipse tool, clicking and dragging, and also holding shift to make it a perfect circle. I'll let go and then come into my contents, my ellipse, and my path, and make sure that my radius, my size, let's make sure the size is a nice even number. I think 200 will work. And since this icon is checked here, when I change one number, it'll also change the second to make it proportionate. I'm going to make sure my anchor point is in the center of my shape by holding Control and double clicking the pan behind tool. Okay, let's get this in position, and let's get the basic animation of this going. We'll start by animating the direction of the circle here. So I'll set a keyframe on my position. In this particular case, I'm going to keep the dimensions together. So I'll start with a keyframe here. I'll go about 40 frames in and push this down. I'll also take my handles here and just give this a slight curve. I think working with curves is just a more natural way of animating. Okay, now let's get the scale going. So what I'll do is I'll bring the scale up by holding S, creating a keyframe. I'll start at 0, make sure that my keyframe is enabled here. I'll go forward 20 frames and bring this up to 100%. I'll go another 40 frames and bring this down to 50%. Now it looks like my circle isn't scaling fast enough, so I can either make this happen every 10 frames by selecting all my keyframes, holding Alt, and dragging my last keyframe in. Let's see if that works. That feels a little fast, so what I'll do instead is I'll just extend my work area to another 20 frames. So we'll go to frame 100 here. I'll bring up all my keyframes, and the halfway mark is now 50, so let's bring these over. And we'll go to 25 and bring this one over like that. Let's go forward 10 frames. We'll bring this up to 100%. Let's start animating the scale by clicking the stopwatch and going 10 frames in. Let's set our first keyframe to 0%. We'll go forward about 10 frames and bring this up to 100%. 10 frames after that, at frame 20, we'll actually scale this to about 50%. Let's see what we have so far. Okay, I think that's a little fast, so what I'll do is I'll select all three of these keyframes, hold Alt, and drag my last keyframe so that it matches with 40, and I'll hold Shift so that it snaps to that keyframe. Okay, I actually need this position to last a little bit longer, so let's move the last keyframe of our Y position to 60 frames, and let's take a look here. Let's also make sure that this is looping here, so what I'll do is I will Alt-click my scale property and type in loop out with a capital O and close parentheses. This way, it will continue to scale back and forth. Now, it is going off screen as it's scaling back up, and I don't want that, so let's bring this whole circle up, and instead of doing it with the position property here, I'll just temporarily create a null object, link the shape to it. Let's take a look at our circle here, and as I move this null object, you'll see that it's moving the circle as well, without actually affecting the position of it, or the keyframes associated with it. Okay, we'll see this little pop here as it loops from this 50% to 0%. So what we actually want to do is loop it from 100 to 50 so that it just goes back and forth from 50 to 100 without this first one involved. So to do that, we actually just need to put an argument inside of these parentheses. So it actually needs to be either a string, meaning text with quotation marks, or a number. So we actually want a string here. So if I press the quotation mark on my keyboard, I can actually set this to ping pong. And what it's going to do is it's going to basically ping pong between the last two frames forever. So you'll see that it's going from 100 to 50 to 100 to 50 as I go 20 frames in. That's 100. You can see it over here. And as I go to 80, 20 frames later, it's at 50. Every 20 frames, it's going from 100 to 50 because it's ping-ponging between these last two keyframes. Let's actually change the interpolation of these scaling keyframes here. So I'll highlight them. I'll press F9 on my keyboard. If your keyboard has a function button, you'll have to hold down function and press F9. And what I'll do is I'll go into the graph editor and I'll actually just select all of these. And I just want to exaggerate these curves a little bit. So I'll click on the handle and drag it out, and I'll also hold Shift on my keyboard to make sure that it snaps to this tangent here. Let's take a look. So basically what we need to do is we need to duplicate this circle so that as this starts to decrease, the next circle starts to increase. So I'll get out of my graph editor, duplicate the layer, and start this layer as this one is starting to decrease here. So let's watch that. Okay, cool. So we have a basic animation going. We essentially just need to loop this at this point, and then we'll blend them together. So as I duplicate this and offset it 20 frames, you'll see that this becomes more of a loop. But the issue here is that we're ending with 2 circles on screen and starting with nothing on screen. So we actually need to start the loop 40 frames in, because that's when we have our first set of 2 circles here. So I'll start my work area by pressing B, and now it's going to just play this area here. So let me play that. And there we have a loop of circles. Okay, so now let's blend these together. So what I'm going to do here is I will right click and create a new adjustment layer. And on that adjustment layer, I'll come over to the effect controls, right click, we want to go to blur and sharpen and throw a fast box blur on this. 50 is about right. On top of this blur, we'll add a curves effect by right clicking, going to color correction and curves. And what we actually want to affect here is the alpha channel of all of the layers beneath it. So what we need to do is actually switch this from RGB to alpha. And now we can crunch the alpha, the edges, by bringing these 2 anchor points here closer together. So as I drag and bring this forward, you'll see that once it's a straight line, it basically just morphs these pixels together. Okay, we also want to make sure that we don't repeat edge pixels here. So now that we have this morphing, we have this little pop at the end. What we need to do is extend this loop one more time. So I'll duplicate my top layer, move it 20 frames forward, and then move my work area 20 frames forward as well. And then you'll see that this now loops pretty much perfectly. So what I'll do now at this point is pre-compose all of these layers here by pressing Ctrl-Shift-C, or you can right-click and pre-compose. And I'll name this Clouds. Okay, what I can do now is trim this layer. So I'll go to my beginning of my work area. I'll hold Alt and the left bracket on my keyboard. I'll go to the end area, Alt, right bracket. That'll trim it to the beginning and end like that. And what I can do now is right click the clouds and we can go to time, enable time remapping. And what I'm going to do is set a keyframe for the beginning here, and I'll come to the end and do the same thing, create a keyframe. And I actually don't need this first frame or this last frame anymore. And now I can bring this to the beginning of my timeline here, extend this outwards, and the last thing I have to do is Alt-click the stopwatch and loop out these 2 keyframes, and it should play forever. Great, so when we turn our rocket ship back on and put the clouds under it, the last thing we have to do with the rocket ship is loop the animation of the Y position and the rotation. So I'll select my rocket ship, press U on the keyboard, and I can just Alt-click the Y position, type in loop out, and do the same thing to the rotation. Everything should loop basically forever. So now I want to actually mirror these clouds here so that it's going from the left side and the right side. So I'll actually just do that with an adjustment layer. I'll put it between the rocket and the clouds. And then on the adjustment layer, I will add a mirror effect. And now I can bring the reflection center to the center of the composition by dragging that or using this icon here. And now we have clouds on both sides. Now it's a little off center here, and since my X position is separated, I can actually scooch this over without messing up my Y keyframes here. So let's take a look. Yeah, I think that was too much, so let's do it like this. And inside of my clouds composition, I can adjust my circles with my null object here, bring it up a little bit, come back out, and take a look. Okay, that's looking pretty decent. Let's change the color of the clouds here. I'll add a fill effect on top of my clouds. I'll make it the color of this darker gray. And what I can do now is duplicate it, make this color the lighter gray. And if I zoom in here, I can swap these, select the top gray layer, and just use my arrow keys to offset it a little bit down, a little bit to the right. So I'll go down on my keyboard maybe 3 times, and then right on my keyboard maybe 3 times. That's going to give it this sort of outline here. And if we want to exaggerate that a little bit more, we can actually go down and to the right a little bit more. So I'll go maybe a total of 6. So we'll go another 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And there we go. We have a little bit of an outline there. And we could keep exaggerating that if we kept moving this down and to the right. But I think this is looking fine. So here we have a looping rocket ship. Now, I guess the important things to remember when looping things are going to be to make sure that your beginning frame and your last frame of your loop are basically exactly the same. Now, you could make a loop so that the first frame is slightly different than the last frame so that you don't have repeating frames. But in this particular case, I actually like that there's repeating frames because it kind of gives a stop to this Y position here. So what we did in this project is we looped the movement of our rocket ship, but we also looped the timing of a lot of it. And what's cool now is that I can take my time remap keyframes and bring them closer together for these clouds here. And I can do that on both of these layers. And it's actually going to speed up the rate of my clouds. So now this spaceship is moving even faster. Or we can slow it down by bringing these keyframes out and making this spaceship look more like it's going through water or jello. Okay, so I hope that answered your questions. My last things that I did on my project here was just add a background and some text that flickers on and off. So nothing too fancy here, but you can see that I just made a little bit of an inspirational quote, because why not? And you know what? I just realized that Don't Give Up doesn't have a period, and it probably should. Only because the top one does. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and let me know if you have any questions at all.